to see you all again, and thank you for having me back again this morning. As we started the last month, we started a new series of lessons talking about the trials of Jesus. So going from the point where Jesus really entered the criminal justice system at the end of his life and going through the various trials that led to his, we'll put in quotation marks, conviction, and ultimately his crucifixion that we read about in all four of the Gospels. And so just as a reminder as to why we're going through these, there really are two objectives. We're looking at these trials from a perspective of, well, basically asking the question, were they legal? Did they follow their own rules? Did they follow their own laws? How they preceded Jesus or pursued Jesus through the criminal justice process? And I think we all know the answer to that question is no, but sort of the more important question for us as Bible students is, well, why are we studying it then? Why is this so important to us? Why is it so important for us to sort of spend our time thinking about the ways in which the Jews and the Romans of Jesus' era violated their own rules when they prosecuted Jesus? And I think there are really sort of two answers for that. One, it tells us something about these people. It tells us something about the people that put Jesus out. If you heard a story about someone halfway across the world who was just, the government went into their home and just ripped them out of their home and took them directly to jail, and then without a trial threw them in jail or kept them in jail or even executed them without a trial, what would that say about the people of that country? What would that tell you about them? Tell them that they didn't care about fairness. It would tell you that if they weren't even willing to follow their own rules, maybe they were just out to get this guy, right? Maybe they weren't really looking at fairness or justice. So it does tell us something about the people in Jesus' era who were actually pursuing him through the criminal justice process, that they would skip or just go around their own rules in trying to persecute him. And the other thing is it tells us something more about Jesus. And as I think we talked about last time we were together, when we gather around the Lord's table in an hour from now, remembering Jesus' sacrifice included a lot of different components. It included him leaving heaven to come to earth. It included him having to be betrayed by Judas. It included him having to go from place to place and see people just not get it when he preached and taught to them. It included a lot of different things. But it also included in his last, let's say, day and a half, to being the victim of an injustice. And that's part of the sacrifice. And I hope that none of us are ever in that situation of facing an injustice where the criminal justice system is used against us, but Jesus faced that. And losing track of his goal or his objective or following through on what he had been sent here to accomplish. And so by going through this and focusing on the ways in which the people who were prosecuting Jesus as a criminal defendant violated their own rules in doing so, it tells us something both about Jesus and about those people. So this morning's lesson comes from Matthew 26. Matthew chapter 26. And I'm just going to read the text first, and then we're going to go back and start looking about what the rules were or should have been as applied to the situation and the ways in which they were perhaps not followed. So Matthew chapter 26, we're going to read verse 47 down to verse 56. Matthew 26, verses 47 to 56. And while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them, saying, "The one I kiss is the man, arrest him." Going at once to Jesus, Judas says, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus replied, "Friend, do what you came for." Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for the sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" At that time, Jesus said to the crowd, "Am I leading a rebellion that you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. All right, so in this lesson in Jesus' criminal trials, we start with the process that leads to the trial, and that is Jesus' arrest. And so sort of the fundamental question we're asking this morning is, well, was Jesus' arrest conducted in a way that was consistent with the law of the day? Did they follow their own rules when it came to the way in which they arrested Jesus? And that's an important question because, the arrest is really often one of the most fraught moments in the entire part of the criminal justice system. Think about what the arrest power really entails. We as a society look at a group of people, in our instance, in our society, the police officers, and we grant them arrest authority. That is, we allow them to go out into public and to take people, throw them in handcuffs in our days, and basically say, you used to live in liberty and be able to go where you want and do what you want, but we're not allowing you to do that anymore. We are taking you under our control, and now you are in our custody, and you are under our control. And, being arrested has a couple of consequences associated with it that you really can't take away. One is we just described that liberty deprivation, that you're no longer able to do what you want. But then think about this, and we all know this to be the case. Once a person is arrested, even if they're later cleared of that charge, they were always arrested, right? And every time you apply for a job, or every time you have to fill out paperwork, when that question comes up, have you ever been arrested before? The answer will always, for that person, for the rest of their life, be yes. And so for a person to face an arrest, they're facing something extremely confining and that has long-lasting consequences. But here's the thing about an arrest. The police don't want to arrest people for things they haven't done, at least in most instances. And the person who's arrested doesn't want to be arrested for something they haven't done in every instance. But at the same time, at the time the arrest takes place, there's been very little investigation, right? There's been no way to determine for sure whether this person has committed this offense or not, right? So this police officer or whoever it is that is has the responsibility of putting this person under the arrest has to decide, well, do I think they did it or not, right? They've got to reach some sort of a threshold of thinking, I am fairly certain this person's done something wrong, or I'm fairly confident that they violated this particular law, while at the same time, they don't necessarily have all the facts in place to be able to know that answer for sure. And so that makes the decision of when to arrest someone or whether to arrest someone to be kind of difficult. And it really means that there needs to be rules in place in a society to make sure that people are not being arrested willy-nilly just because you don't like the way they look or just because you have some wild suspicion that they may have done something wrong. Now, in our society, we have like a constitutional provision that deals with this. We call it the Fourth Amendment, right? And in our society, the Fourth Amendment says that a person is protected from what's known as unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, what does unreasonable mean? Well, you can be a lawyer and spend your whole career arguing about what the unreasonable means in any particular circumstance. But in most instances, it means that you can't arrest someone without a warrant. In other instances, you can, but you can never arrest with someone without this, and this is the magical phrase in our society, probable cause, right? That's the magical phrase. That you have some well-formed suspicion that there is a fair probability that this person has violated whatever particular rule you think they have violated. Now, did they have similar rules like that during this era when Jesus was being arrested? Did they have some rules in place about when and how and under what circumstances a person could be arrested for a crime? Any thoughts? They certainly didn't they? And this will be a question that we will persistently ask through this series of lessons, but the question that comes to mind is, why are they arresting him? mean, I think if we are being brass tacks answering the question, well, they don't like him very much and they want him gone, right? That's why they're arresting him. But there's got to be some sort of a pretense. They've got to have some sort of charge, even though, as we'll talk about, the trials are ridiculous. They don't follow the rules and there is no basis to convict him. They are going to have to go to trial. They are going to have to raise some sort of a charge against him. And as I think we'll see as we progress through these series of lessons, they really struggle to even make something up as to some legal violation that Jesus has been guilty of. But they've got to have some sort of a charge. There's got to be some rules in place. And, as we sort of look around the Bible, did they have these kind of rules? Well, let's look at a couple of Old Testament passages and see back in the Mosaic Law, did they have rules when it came to these sorts of things? Look back at the book of Leviticus. And we'll look at chapter 24, Leviticus chapter 24. What we'll see is that, when you look throughout the Old Testament law, there's not a lot of specific rules on what we might call criminal procedure, but there are some examples which tell us that they did have some sort of at least traditions, if not outright rules, when it came to this sort of thing. So in Leviticus chapter 24, verses 10 through 12, there's a story about these two men who get in a fight. And in the midst of the fight, one of them uses the name of the Lord in vain. And you know how this kind of thing goes, right? They're beating each other up. And as it says here, the one blasphemes the name of the Lord. And under Old Testament law, that was a crime. And not just a crime, that was a capital offense. If you blaspheme the name of the Lord, you would be put to death. And so this has happened, and Moses has learned of this, that these two men are involved in this fight. One of them has blasphemed the name of the Lord. What are we going to do about it? So verse 10, now the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father went out among the Israelites, and a fight broke out in the camp between him and an Israelite. The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name with a curse. So what do? So they brought him to Moses. And then you can skip that parenthetical at the end of verse 11. They quote verse 12, put him in custody until the will of the Lord should be made clear to them. Okay, so they essentially arrested this guy, right? So he has been accused of a crime. He did something was in violation of a known law. They bring him to Moses. They explain what it is that he had supposedly done, that he had blasphemed the name of the Lord. And Moses, it says, until it was shown him by the Lord in those days, what exactly are we supposed to do? What's the punishment going to be for this man's violation of the law? They just held him. And that actually kind of makes sense to us, doesn't it, right? This person committed an act. He is taken to the authorities. They hold him in custody until there is some sort of adjudication on his crime. That seems fairly straightforward and reasonable to us. Let's add one more to this. Turn over to the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 15. Numbers chapter 15. I think we actually referenced this passage last time we were together. But Numbers 15, verses 32 through 34. Numbers 15, verses 32 through 34. This was a man who was caught out on the Sabbath, and he was picking up sticks on the Sabbath to make a fire. Now, as we talked about last time, the Sabbath rules were pretty strict, that you were not allowed to do any work. And at least as we look at it, this probably looks like this violates that rule. And so in Numbers 15 at verse 32, it says, while the Israelites were in the deserts, a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly, and they kept him in custody because it was not clear what should be done to him. And then you see in verse 35 and 36 that God says in verse 35, here's what you're to do with him. You're to stone him outside the camp. Verse 36, they take him outside of the camp and they stone him. The law was very strict back then, right? Blaspheming the name of the Lord, they'll kill you. Gather sticks on the Sabbath, they'll kill you. That's what that shows you. But I do want you to notice what takes place there in verse 32 through 34. The criminal justice process playing itself out. There is an arrest here, right? This man is found picking up sticks. So what happens? The people take him and bring him to Moses. Now, we might call that looks a little like, which doesn't really happen as much anymore, but what you might call a citizen's arrest, right? These are not police officers as we would think of. These are people who saw him do what he shouldn't do, and they brought him and took him to the authorities, trying to figure out what's going to happen with this guy. And so that is, to the extent we have any rules laid out in the Old Testament law, that's basically what it looks like. There were arrests. There was a seemingly, at least a tradition, if not a requirement, that there be some sort of testimony or evidence against this person before that person is arrested. Once a person is arrested, they could be held in custody until there's an adjudication on their case, and then there would be, if that person is found to have been guilty of the crime, the execution of the sentence against them. So that's kind of how things seem to go, at least in Old Testament times. Now, when we get to the New Testament times, is that true as well? Well, when we look over the New Testament, do you ever think, are there police officers in Jewish society at that time? Are there people who are responsible for enforcing the laws, arresting people? Do they have those kind of people in their society? Probably some way, right? There's somebody who's doing that job. Look back at Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. In the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus at one point says, if you've got a problem with someone you know, someone you love, fix it, right? Don't argue with people. Don't cause unnecessary discord between people with you, especially when it comes to your worship. And so he says, if you've got a problem with someone, figure it out, work it out, and then go to worship. Because you don't want to be going to worship when you're having all these dispute with your brother or sister. That's sort of what he gets at in the middle of the chapter. And so in Matthew 5 at verse 25, he says, settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court. Do it while you're still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. So they do have some sort of judicial officers who are involved here, whether they include judges and also this officer that's described there, which seem to be some sort of a combination of what we might think of as kind of a police officer role and officer kind of like a jailer or a warden, someone who's responsible for looking after a person who's been brought into custody. I just point out this verse to show that there were officials within the society at that time that had these responsibilities. That if you were being arrested for some sort of criminal offense, there was someone responsible for doing that, and there was someone responsible for holding you in custody until your case was adjudicated. And so we do see that sort of thing taking place in the New Testament. Now, as we said, in our society, you can't arrest someone, generally speaking, without a document known as a warrant, right? Now, if the police officer sees you commit the crime, they don't have to have a warrant, but generally they do. Right? They generally have to have a warrant that is based on probable cause before they arrested you. Now, is that the case here? Do they have warrants to have a person arrested in that period of time? In what form? So they see it and they offer in-person testimony of this. And that was quite often how these arrests take place. But let's look at another example, and let's look at the life of Saul for a second. Go over to Acts chapter 8. Acts chapter 8. When we first meet Saul, he is doing arresting, isn't he? That's what he's doing. That's how he's spending his time. He's interesting in that respect that I never read anything about Saul that makes me think that he was a commissioned police officer in any respect, right? It's not like that was his profession, but he was doing it. He's out there arresting folks. And so we see in Acts chapter 8 at verse 3, Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off men and women and put them in prison. Now, who told Saul he's allowed to do that? Or under what authority is he just going out there, pulling people out of their homes and throwing them in prison? We would look at that and say, no, you can't do that, right? You're not allowed to do that. One, you would have to have arrest authority. You'd have to be a commissioned officer, and you'd have to have a warrant. You can't just go into someone's house, drag them out, and throw them in prison. But that was exactly what he's doing. Does he have any authority to do that? Okay, so turn over to chapter 9 and look at verse 1, and we'll see exactly what Melanie's talking about. It says, meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. So this is exactly what we're talking about, isn't it? That in order to have the authority to arrest people, and in order to have some sort of commission as Paul saw the man to be able to do this, he went to an interesting figure. He went to the high priest and got these letters. Now, we talk in our society about warrants. This looks very similar to a warrant process to me, right? Police officer in our society goes to a magistrate, says, here's my probable cause. I want you to issue a warrant so I can go arrest this person. In this instance, Saul goes to the high priest and says, I want to be able to arrest these people in Damascus. Will you give me letters to be able to do that? And so the process in that way does look kind of similar. Let's pause here for a second and ask this question. Why is he going to the high priest for this kind of authority? I'm sorry? Okay, so part of the reason why he would go to the high priest to arrest under these circumstances is to ask, well, what's he arresting people for? Some sort of a religious crime, yeah. Exactly. That's exactly. It's a huge and important part of this discussion. They were being arrested for religious-based offenses, and so the high priest, the leading religious figure of that era, was the person to which they would go to. Now, let me ask you this. If the reason why these people in someone's mind deserved arrest was because they weren't paying their imperial tax back to Rome, then who would you go get to arrest them? You go get the Roman government. You go to Pilate, you go to whoever's the prefect or the governor at that time, and you get authority to arrest from them. That in the legal world is something we call jurisdiction, right? Who has the power over this particular person or this particular type of offense? And so in Saul's case, he was arresting these people literally because they were Christians. As it says there in verse 2, and he asked for letters to the synagogue so that if he found any there who, quote, belonged to the way, he might take them as prisoners as Jerusalem. That phrase is interesting in the middle of that verse, who belong to the way. What does that mean? Those who were Christians, right? Now, why does he use that particular phrase to describe Christians? Belong to, quote, the way. And in your translations like mine, the W in way is capitalized, right? What is that referencing? Does anybody remember? Yeah. Exactly. John 14, verse 6, where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And so that kind of became a way of describing Christians of that era. We don't get to name Christian. It doesn't pop up until chapter 12. And so in the very early days, the disciples of Jesus were referred to, sometimes disparagingly by the society, as being members of, quote, the way. And so basically what they're being arrested for here in chapter 9 literally is just being Christians. Because, yes, sir? No, they didn't. No, they did not like that very concept of him describing himself in that perspective. But that's what they're being arrested here for. And so Saul has now gotten these letters to go and arrest people for. Later he describes it this way. Turn to chapter 26. Acts chapter 26. And let's look at verse 12. Acts chapter 26 at verse 12. This is him later on in his life when he's retelling the story of his conversion, looking back at that very moment that we just read about in chapter 9. So here in Acts 26 at verse 12, he says, on one of those journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and the commission of the chief priests. And so that's what those letters that we're talking about was accomplishing. He had authority to arrest, and he was being commissioned to actually execute the arrest. And so that's what that process actually looked like. So in this era we're talking about, again, thinking back to Matthew 26 when Jesus is being approached by this large crowd, and by the time that story's over, they're going to have taken him into custody. It seems like the rules in place at that time were, before you could arrest someone, you would have to go and get letters from the governing authority to be able to take that person into custody. Now, did they always follow these rules? No. I mean, there would be times where if they wanted you gone, you would just be gone. If they wanted you in custody, you'd just be in custody. They would even be willing at times to execute people without demonstrating, without even arresting them. That just, if they wanted you gone, they think you did something wrong, they would just take you out. This is not even the first time that these particular rules were violated in Jesus' life. Turn over to, Luke chapter 4. Luke chapter 4. So when we get to Luke chapter 4, we're pretty early in Jesus' ministry. He's an adult now. He's probably about 30 years old, but he's very early in his ministry, and he's moving round about the region of Galilee, preaching and teaching, performing miracles, doing all sorts of wonderful things. And in Luke chapter 4, at about verse 14, he comes home. And home for Jesus, at least in the early part of his life, was the city of Nazareth. That's where he was sort of raised. Not where he was born, but where he was raised. And so in Luke chapter 4, at about verse 14, he comes back to Nazareth, and he is in the synagogue, and there in the local synagogue in Nazareth, and taking place in a worship service. And at one point in time, it's time for the reading that day, and he gets up and grabs the scroll to read. He grabs the scroll from the book of Isaiah, and in verse 18 and 19, you can read what he read there. And that's a pretty famous passage from Isaiah chapter 61, which looks very much like a messianic prophecy. So in Isaiah's days, Isaiah prophesying that there was going to come this great one coming from heaven to be king of the Jews and to rescue the Jews from the hardships that they had faced over the last hundreds of years. And when he's done reading it, verse 20, then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. And the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began saying to them, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. So what's he saying? I am that person. And so this messianic prophecy from Isaiah chapter 61, Isaiah was talking about me. I'm the one who's coming to save. I'm the one who came from God, from heaven to earth, in order to save you. Now, we read that and say, of course, that's true. That's absolutely right. In that era, if you were not inclined to look at Jesus, this, puny guy from the local village who's now standing up and saying these things, and you hear him say that after reading that, what are you thinking? Which is? This is just this local kid. This is Joseph's son, the carpenter's kid. He's a nobody. He's a no one of any significance. And you might say, oh man, I can't believe that dumb kid would say something like that. Or you might go a step further and say, well, wait a second. It's not just him being full of himself. What has he done here by saying this prophecy of Messiah is referring to me? What has he done here by saying, I came from God? What is he saying? He's putting himself on the level with God the Father. And if that's not true, then what is it? That's blasphemy. Now, okay, let's take this sort of structure that we've already talked about this morning. If you accuse someone of blasphemy, if you think a person is engaged in blasphemy, that passage you read in the Old Testament, what do you do with them? You stone them, but what do you do before you stone them? take him. You got to arrest him first, right? You got to arrest them. You take them to the authorities. There's got to be an adjudication on their crime. And if they've been found guilty under the Mosaic law, you will put them to death. Well, is that what they do here? We'll jump down to verse, jump down to verse 28 and 29. So Jesus gives a long speech after they ask, what are you doing? Why did you say these sorts of things? It says, all the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this, and they got up and drove him out of the town, took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him down the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. So what were they intending to do that day? Kill him. Now, did they arrest him? Did they take him to the authorities? Did they have a trial? No. And so what we've seen here is that when we get to Matthew chapter 26 and we start to tisk about all the terrible ways in which they violated their own rules there, and they did, it's in the first time this had happened. And then even the first time that it had happened to Jesus. But you ask yourself the question, why didn't they follow the rules here? Why didn't they arrest him? Why didn't they take him to the local authorities? Why didn't they go through the process that had been the process for going back to the time of Moses? They didn't think, meaning what? They think, well, if they arrest him, maybe he won't be convicted? That's exactly right. That the emotion of the moment overcame the rationality of the system, and it led them to act rashly. And so, we can try to put all of these explanations in their mind as to why they did it. Well, they were planning this, so they were plotting this, when maybe their easier answer is they just didn't like what was right in front of them, and they wanted him gone. And they thought momentarily they could do it. And they acted irrationally and rashly to try to accomplish that feat. And that notion is going to come up again and again and again as we go through Jesus' trials. When we get to the next part of it, we say, well, why didn't they follow this rule? Or why didn't they do this thing? Or why didn't they actually hear the witnesses? Or why did they kept putting up people who they knew were lying during this trial? And why did they do this with a wink? And why did they do all this sort of stuff? When maybe the easiest answer is, well, they didn't like what they saw right in front of them. They saw an easy opportunity to get rid of him, and they, out of a matter of emotion, just acted very rashly. There's a lot of that going on when it comes to Jesus' trials. And so let's look at another instance of this. Well, another thing to keep in mind about this particular thing is what Luke 4 goes to show us is the irrational anger towards Jesus is not new when we get to Matthew 27. I think sometimes if we segment the Bible or segment the Gospels too much, we seem to think, well, they got to that last week of Jesus' life and man, everyone just turned on him. That's not really it at all. For the most part, especially the leadership of the Jews, they had been out to get him for years. They wanted him dead for years. And let's look at a couple passages to underline that point. Look at John chapter 5. John chapter 5. Here again, we're very, very early in Jesus' ministry. He hasn't fed the 5,000 yet. He hasn't had the transfiguration. He hadn't had most of the events we read about in the Gospels. He's very early on in the ministry. And we get to John chapter 5 at verse 18. And John adds in this detail. For this reason, the Jews tried all the harder to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal to God. So at this early point in Jesus' ministry, the leadership, the group here described as being the Jews, but this is the Jewish leaders, Pharisees, chief priests, Herodians, that kind of groups, all those groups who didn't have a lot in common except that, well, they didn't like Jesus very much. they had all come to the conclusion, and it says we're trying the harder to kill Jesus, which goes to show us we could turn back several pages and see other things, even earlier than this, that made them angry and wanted Jesus dead. And if you're looking for sort of the origin story of what was the first thing Jesus did that made them so angry that they wanted him dead, any thoughts? What's the first thing? What's the first thing Jesus did in his ministry as an adult which led these Jewish leaders to think, we got to kill this guy? So some of his miracles, we definitely see by the time we get to John chapter 11 that the raising of Lazarus was the last straw for them. And we'll actually read about that in just a second. By the time Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, they're like, we cannot let this guy live another week. He's got to go now. So that was certainly part of it later on in his ministry. But what do you think was the very first thing that made them angry? If you were to turn backwards from John 5 and look earlier in John's account, what would John say was the first thing he did that made them so angry? I don't know. But the one that comes to my mind is what happens in John chapter 2. So after he performs that first miracle at the beginning of John chapter 2, the changing the water to wine, the clearing the temple. Tell me why that would make them so angry. Good. So if you read starting at John 2, John 2 verse 12, going on through about verse 16 or 17, Jesus clears the temple. And as we understand it, he actually does this twice. He does it very early in his ministry, then he does it during that last week. But during this first part, he goes into the temple, he sees the money changers. And so he's angry with them for what they're doing there. And we won't spend too much time on this other than to say, basically what they're doing is they're ripping people off, right? And they're ripping people off in the name of religion, right? These offer the sacrifice, and they'll say, sure, I'll give you $2 for 100 of your currency or whatever, and they're ripping them off. And what's interesting is the people who were in leadership of and other places, he was, Caiaphas was the chief priest, but basically Caiaphas was kind of his puppet, for lack of a better term. This guy's running the show. And so this is for a good part of his ministry because of all the efforts to kill him. But here in John chapter 7, it's time for one of the big feasts or festivals, and so he makes his way back to Jerusalem again. Preaching and teaching, there is Temple guards are sent out to seize him. Verse 44 says some wanted to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him. And so verse 45, when the temple guards, they went back to the chief priests and the Pharisees. So you've got what essentially any evidence to support it. So, one last thing we want to make this morning before we're done. Go back to when Jesus himself was arrested and ask yourself,